The Theater is some sort of video game that is supposedly so rare that very few copies of the thing can be found. The basic history behind The Theater is that it was some sort of educational video game released around the same time as Doom. The company that made it went bankrupt after the production, which resulted in the game being extremely hard to find. The few official copies that were made were said to be very odd in their appearance. All they were just a blank white CD-ROM, and the only thing on them was the sprite of the character dubbed the Ticket Taker on the front and back. The Ticket Taker is depicted as a heavily pixelated man with large lips and a red and black suit. He is the only character, aside from the player, that is present in the game. Another urban legend is that if one was to damage the CD, then the Ticket Taker on the cover would develop an angry face. The only real way to play The Theater is on poor quality bootlegs. The game is a nightmare to install and get working on computers because during installation, unless you perform specific tasks at specific points, the installation will constantly crash, stop responding, or even freeze up your entire computer. Examples include having to reboot your computer once you get to the licensing agreement. Even when it is installed correctly, the title screen can give players a lot of trouble. Selecting options crashes the game, and even if you do play the game, exit, and then return later, selecting load is useless because it is impossible to resume a game. So the player selects the only working option, New Game. Then the theater begins. The game itself is not much. The player is put into a movie theater lobby completely alone aside from the heavily pixelated ticket taker standing beside the entrance of the theater room. There is not much to look at except for low quality posters of fictional movies that are mostly illegible. The point of the game is unknown because all the player can do is enter the theater room via journeying into the darkness. The man then tells the player through a low quality audio recording, "Thank you, please enjoy the movie," accompanied by a speech box that reads the exact same dialogue. When the player enters the theater room, they end up right back at the lobby, exactly where they were when they started, and the cycle repeats. While the theater seems to be a very boring and terrible game when hearing this, the interesting part comes in after seeing the reports of the creepy occurrences. The legend says that if the player keeps on going into the room, odd, surreal events take place. There is no pattern to how many times the player must do this to trigger these disturbing events, and it can take as few to just 3 or as many as 400 enterings in order to see the weird results. The most famous weird result is that when the player is placed back in the lobby, the ticket taker is not at the entrance, and when the player journeys into the darkness, they discover that they can walk deeper into the void. The speech and text is still present despite the fact the man is completely absent. After a while, the player finds out that they cannot move forward. The ticket taker then stands before the player, but this time, its face has been changed to a mess of a swirl. The taker is referred to this point as the swirly head man. An extremely high, ear-piercing screech sounds off, and after a few minutes, the game glitches and the player ends up back at the lobby. Other creepy events can also happen after this one. Other examples include the swirly headman pacing back and forth with no walking animation, with white eyes and a worried expression on his face. The posters are also replaced with the swirly headman's face, and he can sometimes appear in the corner of the screen with a brief yelp sound effect playing. One of the more interesting things featured in the game is that the swirly headman will sometimes say another audio file when the player enters the room, but the quality of it is extremely low, and the text box below contains nothing but corrupted characters. What the man says has been debated, but most agree that the audio file records this saying, "Never reach the other levels." After this, the player ends up back in the lobby without the man, and a brick wall is found blocking the entrance. If the player touches the wall, the game crashes. Nobody really knows what these other levels are or how to access them, but considering how much fear the theater places into the hearts and minds of its players, perhaps that's for the best.